So the year is 2017. Victoria and I are dating, and we've been dating for a couple years now. So when we spend time together, it's not like every single time has to be this big fancy date. Like we just want to spend time together, and sometimes that's just kind of hanging out. But I don't have to tell you that in November in upstate New York, there's not a lot of stuff to do. So we kind of run out of stuff, and so we've watched all the series, watched all the movies. But this day in November, we're scrolling through Netflix at my parents' house trying to find something to watch. And we're clicking through all the options. We get to the documentary section. And as we're scrolling through, we see a documentary about this guy called Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy, for those of you who don't know, is not a good man. He's one of the most notorious serial killers, in America, evil, awful, terrible person, but we are so desperate for something to watch, so we're like, all right, we're going to give it a shot. So we fire it up, and immediately we're sucked in. Immediately we're hooked. And this documentary series, it spares no detail. It goes into all the gruesome details. And for years and years and years, he just did all this awful stuff. And after episode 4, after 4 hours, they finally catch Ted Bundy. They put him in prison. Victoria and I are cheering. We're so happy they finally got him. And then he escapes. He gets out of jail, he charms the guard, goes out the laundry chute, and he doesn't just escape, he's gone for years. And he goes on another horrible spree of hurting people, and he goes on, and finally they catch him again, they put him in prison. Victoria and I are yes, they finally got him. And he escapes again. And I'm oh my goodness. So finally they catch him a third time, put him in prison, put him on trial, execute him, justice is served. And so we were finally, oh my goodness, they finally got this guy. But we had binge watched this entire series. It was 8 hours. And it was really late at night at this point. It's November. It's cold. It's dark. It's quiet outside. And now I have to take Victoria home. So we get in my car. We drive into her neighborhood. We park outside of her house. And now's the time where I would walk her to her front door. But there's no street lights. It's really dark. And so we're sitting there in the car, and I'm all right, well, good night. And Victoria she's no chill. Immediately she's what? You're not going to take me to my door? I'm dang it. So we get out, we start walking. It's the longest walk ever. It's cold, it's dark, it's quiet outside. And as we're walking to the door, I'm in my head. And I'm okay, Ted Bundy's not here. It's okay. They got him. But I'm but how do we know? He escaped 3 times already. How do we know? Maybe he's still out there. Maybe. And then I'm well, if he was out there, he'd be an old man, and I could probably take him. I'm but what if he charms me? So I'm just starting to get nervous. I drop her out for the front door. I don't even kiss her goodnight. I just bye, and I head back to my car. Immediately on my right side, the bushes start rustling. And I'm Ted Bundy's here. So I sprint to my car, dive in, peel out, and my heart is just pounding. And it takes 20 minutes for my heart rate to finally come down, to finally realize wow, that was really stupid. Why am I afraid of Ted Bundy in Victoria's bushes? It's not a realistic thing. And I think that was the first time that I realized how powerful what we consume is and how much that affects us. I think we kind of get that, right? We kind of get that the things that we watch or listen to, they can affect the way that we think and the way that we feel. We kind of get that. If we watch scary movies, if we're watching the news all the time or social media, we get that stuff affects the way that we think and we feel. Probably more than we even realize. But I think sometimes that we don't realize as much is that our relationship with food also can affect the way that we think and that we feel. That our diets also have a really big impact on the way that we think and that we feel. Now, I think that we know, like Pastor Josh told us last week about exercise and how important that is. And I think if you exercise, we get that what we eat impacts our physical performance. At the gym, if you're running, whatever, it changes the way that we feel physically, but we don't always think about how it affects the way that we feel on the inside. But it does. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be looking at our diet and how to have a healthy diet. Spoiler alert, we're going to see that a healthy diet is one that has freedom and not restriction. That a healthy diet is one that has freedom, not restriction. Now, before we dive in, I want to address something. I'm a little intimidated by this topic because this is a really heavy topic. I know as I look around this room that so many of us, maybe most of us, have some scars when it comes to our relationship with food. And for some of us in the room, those scars are really deep and really painful. And I want to acknowledge that that is a reality and that I'm not qualified to talk about a lot of those things. So today, I'm not going to be talking about eating disorders. I'm not going to be talking about health concerns like obesity. Those things are real, and a lot of times those are really unique to the individual. One of the core values about Fireside Church is that we want to celebrate uniqueness, that God has made every single person to be unique, and that's a good thing. And a lot of the times we celebrate that together by celebrating the strengths that we have and the different giftings and abilities and skill sets that people have. But we also want to recognize that we're unique in the ways that we struggle and in the areas of weakness that we have. So if you're here today and you're struggling with an eating disorder or you're struggling with a health condition, my only ask of you is that you tell somebody. You talk to myself, Pastor Josh, or another person that you trust, because we want to be supporters and encouragers to help you get some help. So I'm not going to be talking about our diets and our relationship with food from a health perspective, but I am going to be talking about it from a spiritual perspective. What does God have to say about our diet and our relationship with food? And actually, he has a lot to say about that. But brings us to our first question. Does God care about what we eat? I mean, really, this is Sunday morning, we're at a church. Does God even really care about what we eat? Well, actually, he cares a lot about what we eat, especially in the Old Testament. In fact, in the very beginning, the first book ever, the book of Genesis, God is talking to the first two people, Adam and Eve, and he lays out what they should eat. He says this in Genesis chapter 1, speaking to Adam and Eve. God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, they will be yours for food. So in the very beginning, God is giving Adam and Eve, the whole world, all of this food to eat. He's saying that these are the good things to eat. But he doesn't stop there. Most of you may be familiar with that there was one fruit, there was one tree that they were not supposed to eat. They had the whole world full of things that were good for them, and there was one tree that was not good for them. And so Eve ate the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that's when everything started to fall apart. Now, I think when we think about that, we think about how Eve wanted to have wisdom or knowledge or be like God in some way. But a lot of times we skim over something very important. And we're going to see that here in Genesis chapter 3. When Eve saw that the fruit of the tree, this is the bad fruit, was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some of it and ate it. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it. Isn't that interesting? It starts off by describing this forbidden fruit, the one that's bad, as it looked delicious. That was her primary motivation for eating it. It looked good. That's really interesting. They had all of these things that they could eat, and they had this one that they weren't supposed to, but Eve gave in to her hunger, to what looked good, and that pulled her away from God. This is what I want you to see. In the very beginning of time, there have been things that God has said are good for us to eat and things that are bad for us to eat. Our relationship with food has had a direct relationship with our spiritual health since the very beginning. And pursuing your stomach, your impulses, pursuing pleasure is shown as being the opposite of pursuing God and listening to Him. It doesn't just stop with Adam and Eve. If we move forward a little bit in the biblical story where God is talking to his people, the Israelite people, he gives them long lists of food that are good for them, that they should eat, and food that they should not eat. And there's a lot of scripture. I won't go over all of it. I made a handy-dandy little chart here. So if you were an Israelite in the Old Testament, you could eat sheep, goat, ox, deer, goose, chicken, duck, doves, pigeon, fish with scales and fins, locust, cricket, and grasshopper. Thank goodness. If you were an Israelite back in the Old Testament, it was not good for you to eat camel, rabbit, pig, eagle, osprey, hawk, falcon, owl, vulture, swan, seagull, ostrich, bat, shellfish, shark, catfish, eel, worm, gross, caterpillar, snake, snail, lizard, and moles. Oh my goodness. So there was some food that was good for them to eat and some food that wasn't good for them to eat. Now, why these specific animals? We're not exactly sure. There's some practical wisdom here in the food not to eat. Especially back then, a lot of that food had the risk of bacteria or diseases. But what I want you to see is this, is that God has always laid out clear instructions that what we eat directly affects our spiritual health. Our relationship with food is important. Now, that's back in the olden times. What about now? Does God still care about what we eat? Because we're not back in the Old Testament times, we're in the New Testament times. Jesus has lived, he's died, he's come back to life, he's gone to be with God in heaven, and now here we are. Does God still care about what we eat? Well, the answer is no, he doesn't. He doesn't still care about what we eat. And that's because one of the great things that Jesus did when he came was when he died on the cross, he paid the price all of the sin and evil and brokenness in the world and in us. And in doing so, he freed us from having to follow the law and the lists and doing all of those things, avoiding the good and the bad. He said, it's not about that anymore. I've paid the price for that, for anyone that believes in me. So we don't have to, it's not about the what anymore. Now, that seems maybe like, oh yeah, okay, big deal. But it really was a big deal back then. Right after Jesus lived, it was a major source of controversy in the early church because people that believed in Jesus, that came from a Jewish background, were still following this list, even though they believed in Jesus and they were free and they didn't have to anymore. And they were looking down, they were judging. There was judgment on the people who didn't come from a Jewish background, who believed in Jesus and weren't eating and following this law. And so it caused a lot of arguments and divisions and fighting and controversy back in the day. In fact, even Peter, the apostle Peter, the famous Peter, walk on water Peter, fell into this trap where he was judging people who didn't follow this way. And God cared about it so much that he spoke to Peter directly and corrected him in a vision. We can read about it here in Acts chapter 10. Peter became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven opened up and something like a large sheet. It's like a big dining cloth being let down on earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of four-footed animals, as well as reptiles and birds. It had all of the animals on that list. Then a voice, God said to him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." Peter says, "Surely not, Lord. I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." And the voice spoke to him a second time. He said, "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." That's how we can be confident that we don't have to follow this list anymore. God has spoken directly on it. But Peter was making a mistake. Peter was letting his traditions, Peter was letting the way that he was raised and his opinions get in the way of the bigger mission. Because this is about food, but it's also not about food. It's about how Peter was treating people. He was getting distracted from the bigger mission that God gives us, which is to love people like Jesus loves people. And he was letting his prejudices and his traditions and his opinions get in the way of that. So, if God doesn't care about what we eat anymore, does he not care? Does none of this matter? Well, he does still have some things to say about our relationship with food. It's not about what we eat, it's how we eat. It's not about the what. It's not about good or bad anymore. It's about how we eat. And the answer to this is pretty simple. Now, today, all of us, people who love Jesus, the way that we should eat is with moderation and self-control. Not having too much, not having too little, but having self-control with the things that we consume. It's pretty clear here in Proverbs. It says, if you find honey, eat just enough. Too much of it and you will vomit. In the New Testament, in Ephesians, says, do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit. The key here is moderation in what we consume. It's not that some things are good or bad. It's not that food is bad. It's not that honey, sugar, dessert's bad. It's not that alcohol is bad. It's about self-control and moderation. The question is, what are you giving control to in your life? What are you giving control to? Because it's easy for these good things that God gives us to enjoy to become something that is not good anymore when we give up control. Time and time again in the Bible, since the very beginning with Eve, the opposite of pursuing Jesus is described as pursuing your stomach. Pursuing your stomach, pursuing food, pursuing dessert, pursuing alcohol is like a symbol of pursuing pleasure in your life. That you're not pursuing Jesus, that you're pursuing pleasure. Super clear here in Philippians. Paul's writing and he says this, For as I have often told you before, and now tell you again even with tears. He's heartbroken about this. Many live as the enemies of the cross of Christ. Their destiny is destruction, their God is their stomach, and their glory is in their shame. Their mind is set on earthly things. So the question is bigger than food. It's not just about food, desserts, alcohol. It's what do you love? What are you pursuing in your life? What are you worshiping in your life? If someone was to look at your life, would they say that you're pursuing pleasure, these temporary pleasures in your life? Or are you pursuing God? Is your God your stomach, or is your God Jesus? Are you focused on earthly things, or are you focused on heavenly things? What do you find satisfaction and pleasure in? And that's the real big question that we have to think about. What satisfies you? What do you go to for comfort and joy and to feel happiness? It's more than just the things and the good and the bad of what we eat. It's what do we go to for help? It's so interesting that God often describes himself in food terms. It says, taste and see that the Lord is good in Psalms. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. Jesus himself says this, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. We need to be satisfied in God. God is the only thing, this is so important, is the only thing that you can never overconsume. You can never overconsume God. Everything else in your life, if you go to it for pleasure, if these good things become the best things in your life, they leave you empty at the end. But Jesus says, I will never leave you empty. A healthy diet is not about saying no to food. It's about saying yes to God. A healthy diet isn't about saying no to food. It's about saying yes to God. Be filled, be satisfied with Jesus. Now, what does all of this mean for us? Well, maybe you're here today and you're a little bit like Peter. Maybe you have strong opinions or traditions in the way that you were raised about the way that you relate to food, the way that you relate to sugar, the way that you relate to alcohol. And maybe you need to be reminded, like Peter was reminded, not to get distracted from the bigger mission, which is to love people, Is it hard for people to be around you and to eat with you and to have a meal together with you because they feel like you're judging them, you're condemning them, you have strong opinions that you share with them? Don't miss the bigger picture that God gives his people is to love people. Maybe you're here today and for you, food is a little too good. Alcohol, little too good. Desserts, a little too good. It's taken this place in your life where this good thing has become the best thing. Maybe for you, if we're honest, maybe you don't have a healthy relationship with some of these things. Maybe you need to consume a little bit less. Maybe for you, you're here and you go to things like eating or drinking to feel happy, or you go to it when you're sad, or you go to it when you're anxious and depressed and lonely. You go to it to cope. And if that's you today, I don't have to tell you that doesn't work. Like, it may work for a little bit, but it's a temporary pleasure. Don't let the mission of your life be the pursuit of the most pleasure possible, because that is so fleeting and empty. But Jesus says he will never let you be hungry or thirsty again. Be satisfied with Jesus instead. Maybe you're here today, and for you, it's not that food is too good. Maybe for you, food is the enemy. It's too bad. Maybe for you, your relationship with food and drink is that it's the enemy, it's bad, and to get the body image that you want, to get the love that you want, to get the acceptance that you want, food is the enemy. And you've pushed it away. Maybe you've restricted yourself. My encouragement to you is this, is that you're never going to get the love and the acceptance that you want by changing things on the outside. You need Jesus' love on the inside. He's the one that can offer you love and acceptance and happiness and joy that doesn't fade. It's not a temporary pleasure. I mean, can you imagine what it would be like if we didn't have to worry about what we ate or drank anymore? I mean, maybe you're here today and you're a believer, you have a relationship with Jesus, and maybe you just need to be reminded that you're free. You're free. And maybe you're sitting here and you're like, I've gotten a little stuck. My relationship with food maybe is not that healthy. But friend, you're free. You can enjoy the good things that God has made in a way that nobody else can, because it doesn't become the best thing in your life, because Jesus is the best thing in your life. You're free. You don't have to be trapped by that anymore. And maybe you're here today and you're like, you're not so sure about this Jesus thing, you're not so convinced on God, you're not all the way in. That's okay, but can't we all agree, like, man, wouldn't it be nice if you could enjoy a meal and you wouldn't have to worry about an extra pound that you're gaining or a pound that you're losing? Like, wouldn't it be nice if you could have a drink and it wasn't to cope or to fill the void and the emptiness in your life, the hurt that you have, but you could be free to enjoy the good things that God has made? Wouldn't that be better? Guys, a healthy diet is not about saying no to food. It's about saying yes to God. A healthy diet is about freedom. It's not about restriction.